time to ask Mack. You've got a question? He's got the answer.
Time to ask Mack. When you got a question, time to ask Mack.
All right. If you've got a question that you would like me to answer on the air, you can ask your questions in several ways. You can email us at talk@onthemoveshow.com. You can post your questions on our Facebook page, facebook.com/onthemoveshow. You can tweet us at OnTheMoveShow. And when you tweet us, make sure that you include the hashtag AskMack so I can find you on there. And I'll read your questions live on the air and try to answer them to the best of my ability. I have a question that was asked to me earlier this week from Aaron on Facebook, and he asks, what is the full extent of the concept of separation of church and state? Is it employed within the Constitution? Is it in the First Amendment? He had some questions about it, and also its potential misuse within our government. So let me first point out that there are several points that I'd actually need to discuss in order to fully answer this question. And obviously I'm not a constitutional scholar. I just have studied things and I look things up. And feel free to do your own research on this. Like I said, don't take anything I say as scripture, but based on my research, this is what I have discovered. So first, I just want to point out that the United States Constitution only protects us from the federal government violating our rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so it only protects us from those rights that are enumerated in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. So does this mean that the U.S. Constitution does not protect us from state and local governments? Yes. That's exactly what this means, and this is why we have state constitutions. Now, I'll get to this a little bit more, but the First Amendment, let me just talk about that for a second. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution begins with, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It says Congress. And when it's talking about Congress, it's referring to the United States Congress because it's the United States Constitution. So with that said, it only prohibits the federal government from establishing or prohibiting a religion. So the second thing that we need to talk about is the term separation of church and state. Where was this term used? Where was it at? Because it's not in the Constitution anywhere. Well, the term separation of church and state was first used by Thomas Jefferson in a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. He wrote, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between a man and his God, that he owes no account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that the legislator should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." So keep this in mind. This is the wall of separation that we're being told exists. The separation of church and state. This letter is the foundation for that. So what was he talking about when he said that? This was in reference because there had been a lot of discussion that Thomas Jefferson was basically going to attack religious rights once he became president. There was so much fear and fear-mongering about Thomas Jefferson that people of the time, they were actually burying their Bibles in their backyards because they were afraid that Thomas Jefferson would come confiscate them. I mean, this is the kind of fear-mongering that was happening at the time. The election that Thomas Jefferson was in for president, it was fierce and it was very, very vicious. I mean, there was a lot of slandering going on. So, anyway, this was in reference. The letter that he wrote, he was talking about how he was reluctant to set aside calendar days for religious observance as the President of the United States, even though Washington and Adams had done this, but Jefferson wouldn't. And, even though as the governor of Virginia, he did that already. He actually already did those things. And why did he do that? We'll come back to this in a minute. Let's remember that. We'll put a pin in it and get right back to it. In 1947, the United States Supreme Court began to misuse Thomas Jefferson's words in In Everson versus the Board of Education, the United States Supreme Court was asked to interpret the First Amendment's prohibition on laws respecting an establishment of religion. In other words, in the words of Jefferson, the justices famously declared the First Amendment was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state that must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. Not only did the justices put words into Jefferson's mouth, he never said anything about high and impregnable and that we couldn't approve of the slightest breach. He didn't say anything about this, but they also misinterpreted his intentions. And we'll talk about that here. According to Heritage.org, throughout his public career, including 2 terms as president, Jefferson pursued policies incompatible with the high and impregnable wall the modern Supreme Court has erroneously attributed to him. For example, he endorsed the use of federal funds to build churches and to support Christian missionaries working among the Indians. The absurd conclusion that countless courts and commentators would have us reach is that Jefferson routinely pursued policies that violated his own wall of separation. Jefferson's wall, as a matter of federalism, was erected between the national and state governments on matters pertaining to religion, and not more generally between the church and all civil government. So, in other words, Jefferson placed the federal government on one side of this wall and the state governments and churches on the other side. The wall's primary function was to delineate the constitutional jurisdictions of the national and state governments, respectively, on religious concerns such as setting aside days in the public calendar for prayer, fasting, and Thanksgiving. Evidence of this jurisdictional or structural understanding of the wall can be found in both the text and the context of the correspondence between Jefferson and the Danbury Baptist Church. So, what does all this mean? I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you all, but, in my opinion, I think it means that Jefferson was not a hypocrite. He simply believed that the federal government had no place imposing central religion upon the entire country. He believed that the First Amendment prohibited the federal government from setting aside in the public calendar days for prayer, fasting, and Thanksgiving. However, it did not prohibit the states from doing so. And with that said, unless your state constitution has an establishment clause, like the one in the First Amendment, which prohibits the establishment of a state religion, it offers you no protection against your state endorsing any particular religion. Jefferson's refusal as president to set aside days in the public calendar for religious observances contrasted with his actions in Virginia, where in the late 1770s he framed a bill for appointing days for public fasting and Thanksgiving, and as governor in 1779 designated a day for public and solemn thanksgiving and prayer to Almighty God. Jefferson relied on the 10th Amendment, arguing that because no power to prescribe any religious exercise has been delegated to the federal government, it must then rest with the states as far as it can be any human authority. So here's a perfect example for you as to what I'm talking about. In Washington State, where I live, Jefferson would have been prohibited from spending public monies on missionaries and building churches, as he did because of the Washington State Constitution. And I'll read a section from you here. Section 11, this is referring to the freedom of religion. There's a sentence in there, and it says, "No public money or property shall be appropriated for or applied to any religious worship, exercise, or instruction, or the support of any religious establishment." So we can clearly see that Washington State has its own establishment clause. This establishment clause is what separates the state governments from the church. So we have the United States government separated in the U.S. Constitution, and the Washington State Constitution separates the church and the state of Washington. I don't know if every single state has an establishment clause in their constitution. Honestly, I haven't read every single state's constitution, but if your state doesn't, then your state could, in fact, endorse a particular religion, and there's no protection against it. Now, just a caveat on that, Washington State has made some amendments to this provision, this section of the Constitution, in which it allows things like chaplains and hospitals and things like that, and other government provided basically religious services. So, keep that in mind. They have amended it to allow certain things that they're doing. So, but this all brings us to a greater point. And the point is that if you've never taken a look at your state constitution, then perhaps it's time for you to do so. The only thing preventing your local and state governments from infringing on your rights is the state constitution. You need to know what it says. I used to not understand how important the state constitution was. I thought it was redundant, and I didn't think that we needed it. I thought that the U.S. Constitution protected me from everything. But I've recently come to the conclusion, based on evidence like what I just discussed, that I was wrong. I mean, there's piles of evidence showing that the state constitutions protect us from the states, and the U.S. Constitution protects us from the general, i.e. federal government. So each one protects us from something different. But as I always say, the Constitution does not give us anything. It doesn't give us rights. It simply enumerates them, and it tells the government which rights they cannot violate. And I would just like to point out that even though a right is not enumerated in the Constitution, that does not mean that it is not a right. So anyway, we're moving on. I just want to say thanks to Aaron for joining our conversation and for getting on the move. Again, if you have a question and you'd like to have me answer it on the air, you can ask it in several ways. You can call us at 619-924-0986. You can email us at talk@onthemoveshow.com. You can post your questions at facebook.com/onthemoveshow. You can tweet us at onthemoveshow. And don't forget to include the hashtag AskMack so I can find it.